Today is Tuesday, November 2nd, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today I'd like to continue reading and reflecting on Homer's Iliad, and I'm planning on continuing to do this through the entire book, or through the entire poem. It's made up of 24 books. And of course, I'll stop and address other topics day by day as topics come up, but running in the background, I'm going to continue this walk through Homer's Iliad because I'd like to produce this talk for students in my English literature course to help them with their reading, and rather than sit in front of a camera or talk in front of a chalkboard, I'd like to go through this book while I'm out walking so I can spend quite a bit of time on it, because I really don't like sitting around too much. In the last video, Book 1, Part 1, the video is titled, I provided an introduction to Homer, some historical background, and we read through the opening lines and focused on the religious influence of this poem and of the ancient poets. We talked about Homer's invocation of the muse and what the significance of that was, and I asked you to think about whether this spirit that Homer claims inspired his poems was a good spirit or an evil spirit. And I made my case that I would have a hard time buying that the work of the ancient philosophers, even though it's full of all kinds of moral problems, just as the Old Testament is, if we're honest about it, considering what man can be and what the poets were leading men to be, we'd have to agree that it was a good influence. And so today I'd like to just continue reading. I took a lot of time to get into background information and commentary last time. This time I anticipate doing less of that, but I'm sort of just going to read and meditate and sort of put my sails up, as it were, and let the Spirit blow us where it wishes, if you know what I mean. So let's just pick back up with Homer's Iliad, and we'll discuss it as we go. We read yesterday about the offense that Agamemnon committed against the priest of Apollo, and that's where we pick up the story. For Chryses, that's the priest of Apollo, Chryses sought with costly gifts to gain his captive daughter from the victor's chain. So the daughter of the priest of Apollo had been taken captive by Agamemnon. That's why it refers to the victor's chain. She was now in his service, and Chryses, the priest, came with gifts to try and ransom her and buy her back. And we have here a good example of what it means to ransom the captive, which is one of the works of mercy. And this is one of the reasons why, when I was a college student, I found the classics so helpful, because there are a lot of phrases and terms and ideas expressed in the scriptures and in Christian religion that, to be frank, we really don't experience much in everyday life. I don't know what it means to ransom a captive living in suburban New Jersey as a teenage kid. I'm separated from the life of of kings and soldiers and captives, prisoners of war and things like that. Most of us know nothing about that stuff outside of movies. And when I read the classics, I gained insight into a lot of the ideas and events that Christianity and the scriptures dealt with. And here's an example of what it means to ransom a captive. Chryses, the priest of Apollo, goes to Agamemnon with costly gifts to gain his captive daughter from the victor's chain. Suppliant, the venerable father, stands. Apollo's awful ensigns grace his hands. Suppliant is one who usually bows before another and asks for mercy. He comes to Agamemnon, even though he has a powerful position as priest of Apollo, bearing, it says, the awful ensigns, that is, the terrifying symbols of his priesthood. Carrying these symbols with him, bearing the marks of that priesthood, he comes before Agamemnon, and yet he makes no demands, doesn't talk roughly or disrespectfully to Agamemnon, doesn't issue commands in the god's name to Agamemnon, but rather humbles himself, bows before Agamemnon, presents gifts to Agamemnon, and begs for his daughter's release. By these he begs, and lowly, bending down, extends the scepter and the laurel crown. He sued to all. In other words, he made his case to all the men, pleading for his daughter, but chiefly implored for grace the brother kings of Atreus' royal race. Remember, Atreus is the father of Agamemnon, and here we learn of the brother kings, that is Agamemnon, who, as I said in the last talk, was king of Argos, and his brother Menelaos. Menelaos was the king of Sparta. And just to make sure you know the story, the cause of the Trojan War had to do primarily with Menelaos, not with Agamemnon, but with Menelaos. The prince of Troy, whose name was Paris, he was the son of Priam or Priam, the king of Troy. Paris traveled to Sparta, and when a guest visits, one of the religious duties of a devout Greek man in the ancient world was to offer hospitality. And Menelaos, the king of Sparta, offered that hospitality to Paris when he visited. And while enjoying the generosity of Menelaos' hospitality, Paris took advantage of Menelaos and seduced his wife, Helen, the queen, and took her back with him to Troy. And that sin against the rules of hospitality, that act of disgrace and dishonor, is what provoked the Greeks to attack Troy, to avenge the dishonor that Menelaos had suffered from Paris, the prince of Troy. And so here they are, the brother kings, we're told, Agamemnon fighting on behalf of his brother Menelaos, with his brother Menelaos with him. And it's before these two brother kings that Chryses the priest of Apollo comes and begs for mercy. He says, "Ye kings and warriors, may your vows be crowned, and Troy's proud walls lie level with the ground. May Jove restore you when your toils are o'er, safe to the pleasures of your native shore." In other words, Chryses is saying, I pray to the gods that you may be given victory in your military pursuits and that you may all return home safely and be fully restored in peace after this war ends. So Chryses prays for the prosperity and happiness of the Greeks, showing himself to be of good will. And then he goes on with his own request. He says, "But oh, relieve a wretched parent's pain, and give Chryseis, his daughter, to these arms again. If mercy fail, yet let my presence move, and dread avenging Phoebus, son of Jove." And so Chryses begs and makes three different appeals, three different cases for his daughter to be returned to him. First, he says, "Be merciful and grant my daughter's return out of simple mercy towards a father. But if mercy fails, if you have no mercy, then consider these gifts and consider whether these gifts are worth an exchange or a ransom. And if you will not pity me as a father, if you will not respect my gifts, then last of all, I warn you in the name of Apollo." That's who he refers to as Phoebus. That's another name for Apollo, the son of Jove. He warns that Agamemnon should take heed and consider offending the priest of Apollo. So he makes these three appeals for the return of his daughter. Homer then writes, "The Greeks in shouts their joint assent declare." In other words, all of the Greek men, all of the Greek soldiers standing and hearing Chryses' plea, shout and grant their approval. That is, it was the will of the people to show mercy to Chryses and restore his daughter. The Greeks in shouts their joint assent declare, the priest to reverence and release the fair. To respect the priest and to return his beautiful daughter, the fair. Not so Atreides. And this is where all of the trouble begins. Not so Atreides. Not so the son of Atreus, Agamemnon. Not so Atreides. He with kingly pride repulsed the sacred sire or father, and thus replied. Agamemnon doesn't respect the priest, ignores the judgment of his people and responds with the pride of a king. He repulses the sacred sire or the holy father of Chryseis and says, "Hence on thy life, and fly these hostile plains, nor ask, presumptuous, what the king detains. Hence, with thy laurel crown and golden rod, nor trust too far those ensigns of thy God. Mine is thy daughter, priest, and shall remain, and prayers and tears and bribes shall plead in vain, till time shall rifle every youthful grace, and age dismiss her from my cold embrace. In daily labors of the loom employed, or doomed to deck the bed she once enjoyed. Hence then, to Argos shall the maid retire that is back home with me, far from her native soil and her weeping sire." So Agamemnon responds to Chryseis in about as disgusting a manner as might be possible. Disrespectful in every way, disrespectful to the God, disrespectful to him as a father, disrespectful to him as a human being. Speaks in kingly pride and tells Chryseis that he needs to get out of there and go home and pay no attention to what the king does. This girl, he says, is going back to Argos with him and will live as his servant. And he goes even further than that, but we don't need to talk about the details. But he speaks to Chryseis in just the most disgusting, disrespectful, and arrogant terms. And as I said, this is the beginning of all of the trouble for the Greeks. Homer then writes, "The trembling priest along the shore returned, and in the anguish of a father mourned, disconsolate, not daring to complain. Silent, he wandered by the sounding main." The main is the sea. Chryseis the priest returned and walked along the shore, disconsolate, in anguish, trembling, until, safe at distance, that is, beyond the reach of Agamemnon, to his god Apollo he prays, the god who darts around the world his rays, that is, the god of the sun. And this is his prayer to Apollo. "O Smintheus, sprung from fair Latona's line, thou guardian power of Scylla the divine, thou source of light whom Tenedos adores, and whose bright presence gilds thy Chrysa's shores. If e'er with wreaths I hung thy sacred fane, or fed the flames with fat of oxen slain, God of the silver bow, thy shafts employ, avenge thy servant and the Greeks destroy. This was the prayer of Chryses to Apollo. He prays and says, if I have ever honored you and served you well, please hear my prayer, avenge me, and destroy these arrogant Greeks. Thus, Chryses prayed. The favoring power attends. In other words, his prayer was heard, the gods being favorable to him and hearing his prayer. And from Olympus's lofty tops descends. Bent was his bow, the Grecian hearts to wound. Fierce as he moved, his silver shafts resound, breathing revenge. A sudden night he spread, and gloomy darkness rolled about his head. The fleet, that is the fleet of Greek ships, the fleet in view, he twanged his deadly bow, and hissing fly the feathered fates below. On mules and dogs the infection first began, and last his vengeful arrows fixed in man. For 9 long nights, through all the dusky air, the pyres, that is the funeral fires that were built to burn the dead bodies, the pyres, thick flaming, shot a dismal glare. But ere the 10th revolving day was run, inspired by Juno, Thetis' godlike son convened to counsel all the Grecian train, for much the goddess mourned her heroes slain. The assembly seated, rising o'er the rest, Achilles thus the king of men addressed. So Chryses makes his prayer to Apollo. Apollo receives his prayer favorably, is angered by the action of Agamemnon, agrees to avenge Chryses, and comes down, it says, from Mount Olympus with his bow bent, ready to fire away, and he unleashes, in the symbol of these darts or arrows, he unleashes this deadly plague among the Greeks. And we read that for 9 days the Greeks are filled with this disease, and there's death on every side. And then on the 10th day, Achilles, in the midst of the Greek armies, basically stands up and says, what the heck is going on? Get everyone together. We need to gather together for council. We need to figure out what's going on. And we're told that not only did Achilles do this, but he was moved to do it. We read, inspired by Juno, that is the queen of the gods, inspired by Juno, Thetis' godlike son. Thetis is a Greek goddess. She's the mother of Achilles. Achilles is believed to be godlike. It says Thetis' godlike son. He's believed to be what was called a demigod or a hero. He's half god, half man. And Thetis, the goddess, is his mother. And he rises up, calls all of the Greek men together, and it says, Achilles thus the king of men addressed. In other words, he comes in the midst of all of the Greeks to come and speak to Agamemnon about what's going on. Now, as we're introduced to Achilles, remember this was the subject of the opening of the poem. Homer said, Achilles' wrath. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. At this point, Achilles' wrath has not yet been aroused. We haven't read yet of Achilles' wrath, but here we see Achilles stepping into the spotlight of the events as the plague unfolds, as Apollo destroys the Greek armies after Agamemnon's evil response to Chryses. And Achilles here speaks to Agamemnon. He says, "Why leave we not this fatal Trojan shore, and measure back the seas we crossed before?" In other words, let's get out of here. Let's leave. The plague destroying whom the sword would spare. 'Tis time to save the few remains of war. But let some prophet or some sacred sage explore the cause of great Apollo's rage, or learn the wasteful vengeance to remove by mystic dreams, for dreams descend from Jove. If broken vows this heavy curse have laid, let altars smoke and hecatombs be paid. So heaven, atoned, shall dying Greece restore, and Phoebus dart his burning shafts no more. So Achilles rises up and says, it's obvious that this interest of ours in Troy has come under divine cursing. The men whose lives have been spared through war are now being destroyed by a plague. Achilles says, we need to find out what the cause of this plague is. And he immediately thinks of religion. And he says, let some prophet, that is, let some holy man, let some wise man tell us what the cause of this plague might be. Someone who knows the gods and understands what's wrong. Let him tell us what the cause is so that we can make atonement. He says, let the altars smoke and hecatombs be paid. In other words, if we've done something to offend the god or made vows that we haven't fulfilled and have provoked this divine anger, let's make atonement for it and right these things. Someone who knows the will of God, tell us what's wrong so we can do something about it. And if we can't do anything about it, let's get out of here. Homer goes on, Achilles said and sat when Calchas thus replied. Calchas the wise, the Grecian priest and guide, that sacred seer or prophet, whose comprehensive view the past, the present, and the future knew. Uprising slow, the venerable sage thus spoke the prudence and the fears of age. Before I go on with the story, I want to make sure we're paying attention to the religion that's being taught. We see all of this talk of gods and goddesses, of prophets and priests. And we now see Achilles interpreting human events as having divine causes, spiritual causes. We see that there's a spiritual mindedness that's being taught and praised by Homer. Achilles is honorable. He's a man concerned about spiritual things. Agamemnon is dishonorable, proud and disrespectful. He's a man who's not concerned with spiritual things. The readers are being taught a moral system. They're being taught a way of life. They're being taught to fear the gods. And they're being taught to live virtuously, to do good, to respect wise men, to respect prophets and priests, to not act with some kind of human pride, which in classical literature and philosophy was called hubris. You may have heard that term before. Hubris is what we just saw in Agamemnon. An arrogance that has no reverence for the spiritual powers that control all things. Achilles asks with humility. He doesn't come in and pretend that he has all the answers, or that he knows what to do. He calls upon the prophets, the seers, the wise men, to speak and tell the Greeks what's wrong and what needs to be done. And he promises that they'll do it. Achilles is an example of a virtuous and religious man, the son of a god. Agamemnon is an example of a foolish, destructive and evil man, a proud king who acts contrary to the will of his people, contrary to the laws of the gods, and brings destruction on everyone for his pride. But Agamemnon is just getting started. Let's keep reading. This is Calchas, the wise man, speaking. Beloved of Jove, Achilles, wouldst thou know why angry Phoebus bends his fatal bow? First give thy faith, and plight a prince's word of sure protection by thy power and sword. For I must speak what wisdom would conceal, and truths invidious to the great reveal. So after Achilles calls for the wise men to answer and explain the cause of the evil, Calchas, a respected old wise man, a prophet, stands up and says, Achilles, I can answer this question of yours. I can tell you what the cause of this evil is, but I need you to do something for me first. My wisdom would tell me to be quiet and not say what needs to be said, because it's going to offend the powerful. Promise me, Achilles, that you, with your sword, will protect me when I speak the truth. Bold is the task when subjects grown too wise instruct a monarch where his error lies. For though we deem the short-lived fury past, 'tis sure the mighty will revenge at last. To whom, Pelides, from thy inmost soul, Speak what thou knowest, and speak without control. Even by that God I swear who rules the day, to whom thy hands the vows of Greece convey, and whose blessed oracles thy lips declare, long as Achilles breathes this vital air, no daring Greek of all the numerous band against his priest shall lift an impious hand, not even the chief by whom our hosts are led, the King of Kings, shall touch that sacred head. So Achilles assures, just in case I didn't mention Pelides or Pelides, there's always two pronunciations, just to clarify this. When we read an English translation, we can read translated words from the original languages with the sounds of the classical pronunciations of these languages. So for example, that word P-E-L-I-D-E-S, we will pronounce that classically as Pelides. But what you'll find is that in English tradition, there are these anglicized versions or pronunciations of these names. I'm not too familiar with all of them. You'd have to look them up. I would assume that they would pronounce this as something like Pelides or Pelides, but it's hard to follow and know all of their anglicized translations. I would say Pelides, based on the Greek. But Pelides, remember before we saw the name Atreides or Atreides, and we said that meant the son of Atreus, and it referred to Agamemnon. Here we see Pelides, and that refers to the son of Peleus or Peleus, and that's Achilles. Achilles is the son of Peleus. He promises Calchas that he will be safe and that he should speak the truth with no fear. Homer goes on, encouraged thus, the blameless man replies, nor vows unpaid, nor slighted sacrifice, but he, our chief, provoked this raging pest, Apollo's vengeance for his injured priest, nor will the gods' awakened fury cease. But plagues shall spread, and funeral fires increase, till thee, great king, with a ransom paid, to her own Chrysa send the black-eyed maid. Perhaps with added sacrifice and prayer, the priest may pardon, and the god may spare. And so Calchas responds and tells Achilles and the other Greeks, no, this evil that's upon us is not the result of some lack of religion among the Greek men. It's not because we've failed to honor the gods or do something we promised to do. All of this evil, all of this death, this plague is owed to one man and one act. All of this is owed to Agamemnon's treatment of Chryseis, and it will not stop until Chryseis' daughter is returned. The prophet spoke when, with a gloomy frown, the monarch, Agamemnon, started from his shining throne. Black choler filled his breast that boiled with ire, and from his eyeballs flashed the living fire. Agamemnon was enraged at the words spoken by Calchas. And Agamemnon speaks, augur accursed, denouncing mischief still, prophet of plagues, forever boding ill. Still must that tongue some wounding message bring, and still thy priestly pride provoke thy king. Notice that the king, who is guilty of kingly pride, accuses the truth-speaking priest of being moved by what he calls priestly pride, to speak against the king. But Agamemnon has it all upside down. Notice also how Achilles, the warrior, offers his power, his sword, to protect the man who speaks the truth, the religious man, the prophet. We see the purpose of the sword is to protect religion and allow the truth to be spoken. But we see the proud monarch threatening to destroy the truth-speaking prophet with his royal power. For this are Phoebus' oracles explored, to teach the Greeks to murmur at their lord. Agamemnon says, is this the purpose of religion, just so the common people can speak against their rulers? Sounds familiar. For this with falsehood is my honor stained, is heaven offended, and a priest profaned. Because my prize, my beauteous maid I hold, and heavenly charms prefer to proffered gold. So Agamemnon makes his case. He says, she's my prize. She's a spoil of war. I don't owe her to anyone. Am I evil because I chose to keep her rather than to accept some gifts? Is this what you're accusing me of? What have I done wrong? A maid, unmatched in manners as in face, skilled in each art, and crowned with every grace. In other words, this daughter of Chryses that I have taken as a spoil of war, she's a most excellent woman, and I desire her very much, says Agamemnon. Skilled in every art, unmatched in manners as in face, beautiful inside and out, trained in every art, skillful woman, crowned with every grace. I'm not going to let this woman go. Not half so dear, says Agamemnon, not half so dear were Clytemnestra's charms when first her blooming beauties blessed my arms. And here we hear the real evil. Agamemnon already has a wife. Clytemnestra is his wife. And he says, man, this girl is even better than my wife. So we see in Agamemnon an adulterous spirit. And let me ask you again to consider, is this the teaching of an evil spirit? Homer goes on, yet, if the gods demand her, let her sail. Our cares are only for the public weal. Let me be deemed the hateful cause of all, and suffer, rather than the people fall. The prize, the beauteous prize, I will resign, so dearly valued and so justly mine. And just to stop there for a minute, Agamemnon says, look, fine. If me taking this girl is really the cause of this plague, I don't want the people to suffer. She can go. He says, let her sail. My only care is the commonwealth, the public good. And even though she is my just prize, I'll sacrifice her for the sake of the people. Sounds pretty good. Sounds like Agamemnon is yielding. But he's not finished yet. He says, but since for the common good I yield this fair, this beautiful girl, my private loss let grateful Greece repair, nor unrewarded let your prince complain that he alone has fought and bled in vain. And so Agamemnon argues that if I'm willing to give up this beautiful, excellent woman, who is my just reward for victory, I, the king, I deserve the greatest reward, but I'm willing to give it up for the good of the people. However, since I'm giving my prize up for the common good, I believe that it's right that the common people repay me for my sacrifice. The people should be grateful that I was willing to give up my prize, and therefore owe me something in return. And then Achilles, hearing this, responds, insatiate king, Achilles thus replies, fond of power but fonder of the prize, wouldst thou the Greeks their lawful prey should yield the due reward of many a well-fought field? Would you take the rewards away from the men who risk their lives for you, fighting for your brother in this war, here, away from their homelands, fighting your family fight? You would honestly think to take from them their rewards for risking their lives for your sake? The spoils of cities razed or burned down, and warriors slain, we share with justice, we the soldiers, that is. We share the spoils with justice, as with toil we gain. But to resume whate'er thy avarice craves, that trick of tyrants may be borne by slaves. Yet if our chief for plunder only fight, the spoils of Iliad shall thy loss requite. Whene'er by Jove's decree our conquering powers shall humble to the dust her lofty towers. And so Achilles says, don't you dare take from these men who've sacrificed everything to serve your cause. If you want a reward as a king, then lead us to taking down Troy in battle. Lead us to victory in Troy, and you can take all that you want from this city. But don't you dare take the spoils that have been shared by these men who have fought in the fields for your sake. Then thus the king, Agamemnon, responds to Achilles. And thus the king, Shall I my prize resign with tame content, while thou, possessed of thine? Great as thou art, and like a god in fight, think not to rob me of a soldier's right. At thy demand, shall I restore the maid? In other words, do you think you're going to come in here, Achilles, and tell me, the king, what to do? At thy demand, shall I restore the maid? First, let the just equivalent be paid, such as a king might ask, and let it be a treasure worthy her and worthy me. Or grant me this, or with a monarch's claim, this hand shall seize some other captive dame. The mighty Ajax shall his prize resign, Ulysses' spoils, or even thine own be mine. The man who suffers loudly may complain, and rage he may, but he shall rage in vain. But this when time requires, it now remains. We launch a bark, a ship, to plough the watery plains, and waft the sacrificed to Chrysa's shores, whose chosen pilots and with labouring oars. Soon shall the fair, the sable ship ascend, and some deputed prince the charge attend. This Creta's king, or Ajax, shall fulfill, or wise Ulysses see performed our will. Or, if our royal pleasure shall ordain, Achilles' self conduct her o'er the main. Let fierce Achilles, dreadful in his rage, the god propitiate, and the pest assuage. So Agamemnon says, you know what, we'll deal with the situation between us later. Let's get the girl back home and try to end this plague, but don't you dare think that I'm not going to take what's mine. I'm the king. The names here, Ajax and Ulysses, are two of the greatest warriors of the Greek army. Ajax and Ulysses is the same character as Odysseus, who's the subject of Homer's other poem. His Roman name is Ulysses, the Greek name is Odysseus. And so Agamemnon says, one of you men, get a ship prepared, take sacrifices, take the girl, and sail her home, back to her father. And let's get this plague to go away. But Achilles is made angry by this response from Agamemnon. He says, or Homer says, at this Pelides, frowning stern, replied, O tyrant, armed with insolence and pride, inglorious slave to interest, ever joined with fraud, unworthy of a royal mind. What generous Greek, obedient to thy word, shall form an ambush or shall lift the sword? What cause have I to war at thy decree? In other words, what interest do I have in this war? We're fighting this war as a favor to you. And look how you're treating the soldiers in return. What cause have I to war at thy decree? The distant Trojans never injured me. To Phthyia's realms no hostile troops they led. Safe in her vales my warlike coursers fed. I was at peace back at home. No Trojans were bothering me. I have no interest in this fight. How can you think you're going to treat us like this? We're not here for our own sake. Far hence removed, the hoarse resounding main, and walls of rocks secure my native reign, whose fruitful soil luxuriant harvests grace, rich in her fruits and in her martial or warlike race. Hither we sailed, a voluntary throng, to avenge a private, not a public wrong. What else to Troy the assembled nations draws, but thine ungrateful and thy brother's cause? Is this the pay our blood and toils deserve, disgraced and injured by the man we serve? And darest thou threat to snatch my prize away, due to the deeds of many a dreadful day? A prize as small, O tyrant, matched with thine, as thy own actions, if compared to mine. That's a pretty good zinger from Achilles there. He says, are you threatening to take my captive, my reward? He says, she is a prize so small compared to thine, it's sort of like your own actions compared to mine. In other words, I'm responsible for these victories. You do nothing, and yet you get the greatest rewards as the king, while we do the fighting and win them for you. Thine in each conquest is the wealthy prey, though mine the sweat and danger of the day. Some trivial present to my ships I bear, or barren praises pay the wounds of war. But know, proud monarch, I'm thy slave no more. My fleet shall waft me to Thessalia's shore, left by Achilles on the Trojan plain. What spoils, what conquests shall Atrides gain? And there, Achilles says, you know what, Agamemnon? We're not doing this. You can take my prize. You can take my rewards for the victories in the battles. But you know what? I'm out of here. You can fight your own fights. And Achilles threatens Agamemnon with his departure. And he plans to return home because, as he says, this is not some matter of public welfare or self-defense. We're here fighting a private battle for you. And you treat us like garbage. I do the bulk of the fighting, and I go home with trinkets as my rewards. You know what, Agamemnon? You can fight for yourself. I'm going home. And this is the conflict, this is the strife that Homer spoke of at the beginning of the poem. This is the cause of the division between Agamemnon and Achilles. Achilles' wrath, which brought the evils upon the Greeks because he leaves and they lose their greatest fighter. So we have this strife between Agamemnon and Achilles. We have this as another evil brought about by Agamemnon's pride. Not only has he brought the gods against the Greeks because of his sin against Chryses, but now he's robbed the Greeks of their greatest hero in battle and is leaving them now to suffer defeat in war. And with that, I'm going to stop this talk. I think that's a good place to stop. We're at just about an hour right now, so we'll leave there with the division between Achilles and Agamemnon. And I'd like you, as you read this on your own, I'd like you to pay attention pay more attention to the details of the religion and the morals that Homer is teaching through this story. It's just line after line after line, so rich, filled with moral instruction. Questions like, why should men fight wars? What is a just war? That question is answered here in the Iliad. What duty do men have to fight for a king? That question is answered here and discussed and examined in the Iliad. What does a king owe his subjects? That question is discussed here in the Iliad. What should be the relationship between the will of a king and the will of his subjects? That is discussed here in the Iliad. All these fundamental concepts of religion, morals, political science, all here for us to study, to examine, to meditate on, to discuss. This is the richness of Homer's Iliad. All of these moral questions, philosophical questions, political questions, military questions, questions of life and death, questions of justice, questions of worship and devotion, religious duties, effects of human sin. All of these issues are here presented to us in the Iliad by Homer. Don't get lost in the story like a child watching a movie. Realize that this is all Homer teaching us, speaking to us, leading us. All of this, every character, every word, every speech in every character's mouth is crafted by Homer to teach. This is a work of art. Don't get lost in the story. Don't get lost in the characters. Stay focused on Homer. Imagine if you were in the banquet hall. Imagine if you were in the banquet hall sitting there while this man recited this poem in front of you. Imagine how incredible that presentation would be. And all of this story is coming from this one man telling this story. That's what's amazing about Homer. That's why we're talking about him and reading his books 2,800 years later. It's not because of the book itself. It's not because of the story. There are plenty of good stories. The richness of Homer's writings is that he addresses so many crucial questions, the deepest questions, the most important questions of human life are investigated in every line, in every speech, on every page in Homer's writings. And if we read them, and read them carefully, we're not skimming through the story so that we can know some trivia for some lazy coffee hour talk to try to show ourselves literate people. This poem is intended for wise men to meditate on, to chew on. And every line provides us with rich content for meditation, for discussion, for writing, and so on. And so I want to encourage you to not get lost in the story like a child, but keep your eyes focused on Homer And think of all of this as a message from an ancient wise man teaching you this story because he has a purpose in doing so. I hope that's helpful. I'm going to cut off there. If you've got any questions about anything we've read, feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to answer those kinds of questions to make sure that your ability to read and understand and enjoy this work is helped by this exposition and discussion. God bless.